now that we have our mortises done, we're going to go on to our tenons. So anytime you're doing a mortise and tenon, you always want to do the mortise and then the tenon. So I've got my two top rails, which are 1 7/8 inch wide and 3/4 inch thick. And then I've got my bottom one, which is 2 3/8 and the same thickness, 3/4. So I'm going to point out with this, with the templates, so these are the two different templates, same profile, but obviously one's wider than the other. The measurement from hair to hair is to shoulder to shoulder. So I want to explain what that means first. So here's an inch core tenon, meaning that tenon is a part of this. So not like a domino, a slip tenon, loose tenon, where you do a mortise and then you put a piece of wood in there. This is a part of it, even though it's rounded. A lot of times people see rounded and they think domino. Not the case for this. So what I'm about to do, so for the shoulder to shoulder, that is the measurement from hair to head. That's your shoulder on the tenon. The cheeks are this right here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to actually cut around this on the table saw just with an 1/8 inch blade. So we're saw curving it around. So we need to know, we use a sled, we need to know how high up we need to come from the top and the bottom, and also from the two faces. And that's going to establish our shoulder. Now, if you have a good dado blade, you could probably skip that step, but I like doing that because it establishes a very crisp shoulder, and that's all you see. When this goes together, that's what you're looking at, so it's very important. And if my dado blade doesn't do a very good job, that's just not going to work out very well. So when I end up dadoing, I'm not going to hit that shoulder again. I come away from it. So the templates are the shoulder to shoulder length. So you need to make sure you add on the tenon length if you end up getting these templates, because that could throw you off. You'll basically be 1.5 inches too short. So the tenons are 3/4 inch. They're basically just going to come flush through hair, and then we'll clean this all up and wedge it and stuff, just like this guy has. So the little saw curve for the wedges. So with all that being said, we need to establish where that tenon is actually sitting within this piece. So it's pretty easy this way because it's 3/8 of an inch. The mortise, the width of the mortise thickness is 3/8, and this is 3/4. So just divide, the remainder by 2, so it should be 3/16. So the blade will come up 3/16, and we'll cut 3/16 and cut. So that one's easy, and that'll be the same for all of these. The next one is a little more difficult. This rail here, the tenon again is in the center this way. And so I'll just reference the actual plan itself, and I'll go through and look at what those offsets are and mark that out. So on this guy, it's 7/16. So I'll put this in my vise, and I'll lay out 7/16 and 7/16, and then that's going to be where I want that blade height to go to. And I'll just do the same with this. Now, this is not symmetrical. It's not in the center. It's favored to the bottom, so I believe it's an 1/8 inch up from the bottom, and then I think it's a 1/4 inch at the top. And so just reference your diagram again, and that's what it looks like, 1/8 and a 1/4. So it's not in the center this way. So it's important that you kind of get your head wrapped around that, so when you go over to the saw, there's no kind of second guessing things, and you can go ahead and get it done. And I'll kind of show and explain how I do that. But first things first, these have been milled, they've been cut to the final length. Now I want to establish how I want this piece to look within the actual piece. So meaning, what looks better to me, what's up, what's down. So I'm just going to come here and pick a side that I like the look of, mark it like so. So I know this is up and this is out. And I'll do the same with these guys. So I've got one mark there, and I'll go ahead and do this one. And this is obviously important because it's not centered, so we're going to have to make sure we know the top and the bottom side of this. I'll lay out one of these and just use that as the reference. And so I'm going to come from the bottom 1/8 of an inch. Let's use this guy. I'm going to come 1/8, and then I'm going to come 1/4 from the top. And this is just so when I go over to the saw, I can use this as a reference to set it up. That should leave me 1.5 inch for the actual tenon. The tenon is 1.5 by 3/8. As far as the center goes, you know, I can use my calipers. So I've got this set up at half of 7/8, half of 3/4. And actually I don't have it set up. Let me just check this. Yeah, so then I can just use this as a reference to just find that center. So 0.375. So that's going to find my center. Just, you know, flip flop it, make sure that you're right on. And then I can come off that, you know, 3/16 from that back. And so it allows me, again, it's just so I can go to the saw. I'm not going to cut right to these marks. I'm going to sneak up on this fit. But essentially, that's what we're trying to do. So I'm trying to just find that tenon within this piece. And so when I go over to the saw, I know exactly what's going on. So I'll do the same for the other rail, which is a lot easier. And then we'll go over to the saw, set up the tenon length, and then we'll shoulder this, and then we'll set up a dado blade, and we'll take away the waste material. So to establish the shoulder cut, we're going to do that on the table saw with a sled. I went ahead I just took a little block, this little push block I had laying here, but this has a flat edge, and I went and did the offsets. I just marked it so I can use that. I'll come, put it on there, raise the blade to it, and get it close. So I've got 7/16, 1/4 inch, 3/16, and an 1/8 inch. And that'll just help me get the height set to what I need. I also went ahead on a lot of these parts, what I typically do is I won't lay out all of this. I do the initial layout so I know what the numbers are. But then I'll just mark it on here. So I've got 3/16, 3/16, 7/16, 7/16. And so I know when I come over here, it's like, okay, this is set for 3/16. I know which one has to get done. This is pretty simple. There's only 3 rails, but sometimes it can be multiple rails, and it can get a little confusing. One last thing is that we need to do is establish the length. So I went ahead and marked my 3/4 inch. That's the tenon length. I'm just going to put a little X on this side so I know that this side is the waist, and the stop will be set out here. This is called an outboard stop. At least that's what I call it. But basically, these have all been cut to length, and when you do stuff, anything that's the same, like, so these 3 need to be identical. When you do that, you use a stop. You don't just measure, mark, chop saw it, measure, mark, chop saw, because again, it's those variables, they add up. If there's little nuances, if they add up, and they're going to end up, this piece is going to be all kind of crazy. So if you can fine tune that by using stops for repeatable cuts, that's going to help. So the idea of this, since these are the same length, you could set up a stop out here, but I'm in the habit of always setting up over here because a lot of times in a piece of furniture, the thing that's the same is the actual tenon length. So in this case, it's 3/4 inch. Now, what if we had a rail on a piece, say we're doing something a little more complex, that's longer, but the tenon is also 3/4 inch? You'd have to move that stop back and forth, back and forth. So instead, you've already cut those 2 lengths at the same time, the companion pieces got cut at the same time. Then you set this up, and now you just go, no matter what the length it is, you never move this, and you're always going to get the same 3/4 inch tenon length. So that's what's important here. And so I'm going to raise the blade up, line up. I'm just going to line that cut up. And I can bring this guy over and clamp it down. I also like going to a screw, to a center point instead of, say you have a big flat edge like this. So as you're pivoting up and down, it could be referencing at different places. The screw, the point seems to help with that. So when you go through and do the entire shoulder cut, they should line up at the end and not be offset. All right, so that's good. Now we're going to set the depth. I'm going to go ahead and do the face on all of these. So 3/16, because we just take care of that right away. So I'm going to go to there's 1/8 and there's my 3/16. I'm going to go below it and then raise it back up to that cut. And that looks pretty good. All right. So I should be able to just, go through to this cut, flip it over, and do that to all the rails, and then change the height for the next one. So now that I've done all the 3/16, I'm just going to go ahead and take care of this one since it is symmetrical. So the 7/16 next. So again, you don't need any fancy gauges for this. I just scribed the 7/16 mark, and I'll just raise my blade up to that. And it can be just a hair past it. When I do the saw curve, if I go just a little bit deeper than it needs to be, when it comes to wasting away the cheek later on, I don't have a little ridge there that I need to get in with a chisel. So yeah, so it's just gonna be this guy, this guy. So you probably can't see this, but right in there's the tenon. So that's what we were trying to find, that tenon within this piece itself. So that one's done, and then we're dado and just kind of waste that away, and that would be where we sneak up on it until we get the fit, which will be matching the actual mortise. So these, let's see, I think it was an 1/8 and then a 1/4. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do the 1/4, which is the top side of it. Make sure I do that right. Now the last one is the 1/8 inch. So we have our shoulder established, and it's nice and crisp, and it meets, all the way around. It meets up at the other side. There's a lot of little small factors here that make that successful. Obviously this stock, the ends need to be square to start with. Coming to a screw really helps. Your sled has to be kind of square. If your sled's not kind of square, things won't line up. And how you push this. A lot of times I'll see people pushing at one end, one side or the other, and that can rack things. So you just got to be really methodical about going in and back and doing the same thing, the pressure, how you hold the piece, being mindful that there's not dust stuck down here. All those small little things add up, and you should end up with a perfect shoulder cut all the way around. So now I'll break this down. I'll probably set up my L fence so I can use my dado stack and not have to have a sacrificial fence that I'm burying that dado stack into. So I'll kind of show that. If you're not familiar with an L fence, it's a great jig for a table saw. And then we'll actually take care of the cheeks first, and I'll aim for being too low. So when I flip flop, it's gonna be too tight, and then I'll slowly raise it up, flip flop, until I get that perfect fit. And at this point, if you were smart, you would have done a test piece. I did not, so I can't screw one up. But if you have a test piece, that's where you wanna do all this type of things, like get that fitted just right. So now I'm gonna go ahead and waste away the cheeks to the tenon. I'm gonna do that first so we can make sure we get that fit. I've started off where I know it's too low, and then I'll just flip flop, check it, and just work the blade up until I get the side fit for the actual mortise. So I have my actual piece to have mortise, so I'm testing that instead of trying to go off an actual measurement. That's what's important. So I'm doing this with an L fence. L fence is very simple. Obviously the name comes from the fact that it just looks like an L. you could just have a 2x6 hair with some holes cut into it and do it too. The nice thing with this is it's adjustable. And yes, it's from my buddy, Chalkstone Woodworking. So he makes these and sells these. So he's on Instagram as Chalkstone Woodworking. His name is Ben Brunick. Does a really good job on it. So I use it for multiple things. I won't get too much into that right now, but essentially so I'm trying to cut 3/4 of an inch. If you do that, it gets kind of tricky. You can do it where you set your fence off from this side of the blade back 3/4 of an inch dead on, and then you could start, further to the left, make a cut, and then hit the fence and make a cut, and that's fine too. I like to do this technique where I don't have to use a sacrificial board like this. So multiple ways to do it. So whatever you're comfortable with, maybe you have a way that you like doing, go ahead and do that. The main thing here is just to get a good snug fit. This cannot be rattling around in that mortise. Okay, so the first one's going to take a little time because it's a bit of a trial and error, but really just babying it until you get that fit. And that's where a test piece comes in handy. And so I'm looking for a way, you can pick up the piece with it, so it's not slopping around in there. So that looks good. Now the rest will go really fast, so I'll go ahead and do the other ones. And then to waste away these guys, I'll probably just do that on the bandsaw. We'll just go to the bandsaw, nibble that off, and then it's back to the bench, rounding them over. So I'll go ahead and just take care of the rest of the tenons, and then bandsaw, and then bench. So now that we have our square tenon, it's kind of a decision you can make. You can either square your mortise itself, or you can just round these over. And I typically like the look of the rounded tenon, and it's a little bit easier than squaring out all those corners for the mortise. So for that, since it's such a little piece, I'm not going to try to do any fancy setup on the router table with like a 1/4 inch round over. It's just not worth the time. So I'm just going to simply use a chisel, maybe a rasp, and come back and start establishing like a chamfer and then round that over. Now, you need to be careful with the rasp, the chisel, the sandpaper, whatever you're using, because remember, what gets seen is this shoulder. So if you're just smashing this in there and you're putting all these dents and stuff, where you use the rasp and you're not paying attention, but you're grinding away at the shoulder too, it's going to not look very good once it comes together, and you may not even realize it until it goes together and you're like, dang it, I wasn't paying attention to that. So just be real careful with that. I'll get it close, and then I'll use a piece of sandpaper and simply come at the end here and work that and try to get it a consistent round over. We are going to be splitting this for the wedges, so you have a little forgiveness there too. So when this tenon goes in, if there's a little bit of a gap on the top and the bottom, that's actually okay, because we're going to put that wedge in, which will then make it tight again. So, but that wedge will only do so much. If there's a big old 1/4 inch gap, you're not going to close it. Another thing to really pay attention to is keeping these walls parallel to each other, these sides here, because what ends up happening is when people start sanding, they inevitably do this, like a backward dovetail, because it's really easy to sand this edge too far than the edge towards the shoulder. And if you end up doing that, when that wedge goes in, it's going to tighten up on the inside but not the outside, and you'll probably try to pound it and break something. You'll split either the rail or pop out the end grain there, so you've got to be really careful with that. So just put some good music on, take your time doing this part. Sanding block 2, I think this is like 120, you can use 100 grit. cut right back, so you're not wrapping the sandpaper over and then you're going to hit up against this. This way it's not going to jeopardize that shoulder. All right. So I've just created those facets on that, and now I'm going to come back and chisel it all the way back to the shoulder. I'm using an undersized chisel here so that I'm not smashing into the actual shoulders themselves. So that's kind of got it close. So now I just need to clean up the shoulder hair a little bit where I didn't cut as deep as I usually would with that first shoulder cut. So now I've got this little piece remaining. So I'm just going to clean that up, and then we can start testing this fit. So that's the outside. So now it's just time to test the fit. And it looks pretty good. Might be a little bit tight. That's what I'm looking for. The shoulder looks nice and tight all the way around. So that's looking pretty good. Didn't quite come all the way through, and I think that's because, yeah, no, that's right on 3/4. Yeah, it's like a 64th over. So I'll just sand that all in. Probably should have checked that ahead of time, but that'll work. So yeah, it looks nice. We'll do the saw curve and that really pinch that up tight. So I'm just going to repeat the same steps to the rest of them.